you get the crisis in ex-Yugoslavia, in the Balkan, when suddenly a lot of people start to flee. They don't flee an individual persecution. They're not persecuted because of their beliefs, because of their religion, because of being member of a social group. They're not individually persecuted, but they flee a war, a civil war, a very savage civil war. And they come into Western Europe, and most countries do not grant them refugee status. Because according to the Convention of Geneva, you had to be individually persecuted. But on the other hand, one couldn't send those people back to the war. And especially Germany had to take in thousands of Bosnian refugees, or Croatian or Slovenian refugees. And this has put pressure on the whole immigration policy of Europe. And especially Germany wanted very much a burden sharing, wanted other countries, those who were not bordering Yugoslavia, those who were not bordering Eastern Europe, where all the refugees came from. So they wanted to have a burden share, so that countries which were further inland would also take their share of the costs. This has created in 2004 a new directive on refugee protection within the European Union, which has enlarged the definition of refugee, in the sense that you get, first of all, you get people who flee collective violence. They're also eligible for asylum, for refugee status. And also you get a broader definition of who is a refugee. So you get a definition of social groups, because that was one of the difficulties within Europe, that every country has its own eligibility policy. So certain people were considered refugees in Belgium, like, for example, but they were not being seen as such in Germany or in France. Like people who were persecuted because of sexual orientation in Germany, they were mostly not being recognized as refugees, while in Belgium they were. In Belgium they were considered a social group who, on basis of the Convention of Geneva, could be a refugee. This very different national interpretation of the Convention of Geneva, some countries who adapt to the different way we look, for example, to gay persons now, who adapt that in the refugee law too, and then other countries who stick to the definition which was valid in the 1950s. This now has, in 2004, in the Directive of the European Union, this has been adapted towards a more harmonized definition of what a social group is, and for example gay or even women, so the persecution because of gender is now much more, it has been now accepted within the European Union that this can be a grant to grant somebody asylum. So you get these divergent interpretations which have been given way to a more harmonized definition of what is being written down in the Convention of Geneva. The same for those fleeing collective violence. So there are now provisions within the law, within the European law, and then within national, and this is being translated to national law, which provide for asylum for groups who didn't get asylum between 55, 54 and nowadays, because it was not so explicitly stated in the Convention of Geneva. So you get within Europe a broader definition of refugee, which is a very positive thing. But on the other hand, you see also that in general immigration policy is getting much tougher, it's much more difficult to get here from the south. And although we have a broad, expansive definition of refugee, the most difficult thing is to get here. And it makes it, of course, comfortable for European policymakers to adapt a generous definition of refugee. And I think it's a good thing that this definition is broadened. But if hardly any people can come anymore, can flee anymore towards Europe, it's of course not so important, one could say. I think it's still important because everybody who comes in this region here, within Europe, um, to all of them will apply this more generous definition. So that's a good thing. But one should also think about ways, once you see it within a broader framework of the global immigration policy, which is getting much more tougher, much more difficult to get here. The barriers are much higher than they were ever. There's much more control. There's much more subcontractor of immigration control to transit countries. So for refugees, it's very difficult to get here nowadays.